Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Lachlan Mackenzie, and I've been asked to do the introductions. Dr. Ad Foolen is newly retired after a long career as a linguist at Radboud University in Nijmegen, in the southeast of the Netherlands. His major specialism is in particles. No, not the quarks and leptons of nuclear physics. His field of expertise is populated by those little words that cluster in the middle of clauses in German and Dutch and such languages. More recently, his attention has turned to the role of emotion in language. And that is then the subject of his talk today. On Wednesday, we discussed the notion of valence, and this reappears in his very recent article, Word Valence and Its Effects. Ad's perspective on language is chiefly that of cognitive linguistics, and he is currently the secretary and treasurer of the International Cognitive Linguistics Association.
Is it yours? Oh, sorry.
And together with Ulrike Lüdke, Tim Racine, and Jordan Zlatev, he edited Moving Ourselves, Moving Others, Motion and Emotion in Intersubjectivity, Consciousness and Language. And this book includes his valuable essay that everyone in our research group has read and studied, The Relevance of Emotion for Language and Linguistics. He's worked with colleagues on the expression and conceptualization of emotion in various languages, in particular in his native Dutch, but also in, for example, Indonesian and Japanese. Okay, well, no further intervention from me. Let me give the floor to Ad. His talk today is entitled, as you see, Emotion in Language. And, you'll be speaking for up to an hour, but whatever time remains is then available for discussion. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Lachlan, thank you very much for this nice introduction. I immediately feel at home because we have been colleagues in Holland for many years, you in Amsterdam, I in Nijmegen. Also, many thanks to Laura Alba, who invited me to give this presentation today and to become familiar with your research project here in Madrid. So we just had an interesting lecture about emotion, evaluation in language use, in texts. My focus will be more on language, on the language system. That's why I chose the title Emotion in Language. I apologize for my English. I'm not an English teacher or whatever. I use my school English, but if I don't know, Lachlan and I agreed that if I don't know how to express myself, I will say it in Dutch and he will translate. I prepared more or less 73 slides, and the first 17, or 3 to 17, will look back at linguistics as a field and in how far emotion is paid attention to. And then the main part, about 40 slides, will be about recent research in linguistics, and we will look at different constructions, morphology that, in my opinion, have expressive emotional value. And then in the last 10 slides, we will look ahead and see how in the near future we should try to model emotional phenomena in a linguistic model. I mean, linguists always want to have a theory, a grammatical model or something like that, and so maybe something is available. Let's see. So if we start to look back, Edward Sapir, in his very readable language introduction to the study of speech, has skeptical passages on emotion as part of the language system. On the whole, it must be admitted that ideation reigns supreme in language, that volition and emotion come in as distinctly secondary factors. And another quote, all this does not mean that volition and emotion are not expressed. They are, strictly speaking, never absent from normal speech, but their expression is not of a truly linguistic nature. So this all sounds rather skeptical, I would say. So I call him the skeptic, but luckily we also have Roman Jakobson, and in his famous closing statement, 1960, there we find more encouraging quotes like the emotive function laid bare in the interjections flavors to some extent all our utterances on their phonic, grammatical and lexical level. If we analyze language from the standpoint of the information it carries, we cannot restrict the notion of information to the cognitive aspect of language. So language also carries emotive information, not only the cognitive information. As Lachlan already said in his introduction, my framework is cognitive linguistics, and this well-organized field. We have this ICLA, so now comes a few slides of advertisement for our organization, the International Cognitive Linguistics Association, and we developed a new website. I recommend everybody to go and see what is there, cogling.org. And here is Antonio Damasio, who gave a plenary lecture at the ICLC 4, that every 2 years we have an international conference, the International Conference for International Cognitive Linguistics Conference, number 4 in Albuquerque in 95. And this plenary lecture by Antonio Damasio had a strong influence on me. I mean, everybody knows this book where he says that reason cannot exist without emotion. You cannot make decisions if emotion is not involved. So he says that, and this is part of the affective, emotional turn that took place in psychology. That psychology, which was strongly oriented to studying cognition, realized that emotion should be included. And Damasio argued on the same line, and then the idea came to me, well, if emotion is so strongly related to cognition, and if we in cognitive linguistics study language in relation to cognition, then we cannot exclude emotion, right? So from then on, I started to explore how we can take emotion on board. Maybe I should have put this slide earlier, but the ICLA has affiliate organization in every country, and this is the advertisement for the Spanish affiliate organization, the Asociación Española de Lingüística Cognitiva, and a very active organization, I must say. I looked at the website of the Spanish affiliate organization, looking whether the word emotion occurs in their in the topics of research they tell us that cognitive linguistics deals with. And I find important notions like iconicity, I will come back to it, the relationship between language and thought, psychological environment of linguistic experience. These are all phrases that could lead to emotion, but emotion is nowhere mentioned explicitly. So if it is there, it is still rather under the surface, so to say. And then I looked in the handbooks of cognitive linguistics. There are 3 very good handbooks, 2007, edited by Dirk Gerhards and Hubert Kuykens. More recently, Jeanette Littlemore and John Taylor, the Bloomsbury Companion to Cognitive Linguistics, and this year it was presented at ICLC 13 in Newcastle, the Handbook of Cognitive Linguistics, edited by Eva Dabrowska and Dagmar Divjak. They have chapters on many different topics, but in none of these handbooks there is a chapter on language and emotion. In contrast, the body is strongly present in cognitive linguistics. So each of the handbooks has a chapter on embodiment. As you probably know, embodiment is an important notion in cognitive linguistics. The idea is that our conceptualization of the world and of abstract parts of the world, like our emotions and our cognition, is based in the body. So the idea of in and out is based on our body, inside, outside, upside, down. All these orientations and many metaphors are based in the body. I mean, if we talk about the foot of the mountain, the arm of the river, the head of the organization, or the center or the heart of the city, and metaphors and metonymy, figurative language is important if we talk about the world, and the body is often the source domain. And in the second point, it is claimed that if we use language, the meaning is not only processed in our linguistic center, so to say, but the body parts are activated. So if we, and they make the meaning meaningful for us. So the typical example that's often given, if we use the verb kick, to kick, our foot and leg is in a weak way stimulated. So we make a kick movement inside, and our body acts out what we communicate, and this helps us to process the meaning. So the neural area is activated during language processing. So yes, the cognitive linguistics, that's the good news, is not restricting itself to cognition, but taking in the body. And it would be natural if you go out of the cognition and go to the body, that emotion is not far away. But in some way, it's still rather a blind spot in my so beloved cognitive linguistics. These days, linguists do not only study language and the language system in itself. It's rather popular to study language in relation to something else, and the same in cognitive science, psychology, to study the relation between emotion and cognition. We already talked about it. There are many fascinating books. I mentioned one here about body and emotion, the feeling body, affective science meets the inactive mind. Well, language and cognition, we talked already about it. Language and the body, it's strongly present in cognitive linguistics. More recently, language and culture, I mean, it has a long tradition in anthropology, but people like Farzad Sharifian are very active in, reactivating cultural linguistics. He started a journal, the International Journal of Language and Culture, with Benjamins. So he is a kind of driving force behind studying the relation between language and culture. And again, language and emotion, it's still on the agenda.
We are going to read that. We are going to read that one.
You're going to?
The group is going to publish that one, the one on language and emotion.
Right. Good news.
You are going to be one of the authors.
You see? I feel honored.
Very dangerous to come here.
So in the past years, I invested some energy in exploring literature also outside of cognitive linguistics and finding the authors who said something about emotion in language. And I wrote 3 overview articles, one in 97, this one that Lachlan just mentioned already, and the most recent one in the Routledge Handbook of Semantics, edited by Nick Riemer. And this overview article is called Expressives. By the way, you don't have to take notes. I can send this PowerPoint to Laura and she can send it to you. Even also, if you want some of the texts that I mentioned, I can send them. I can send this overview paper and other papers. Laura can distribute them to you. Also, papers by other authors that I mentioned. Most of the time, I have them in an electronic form. So.
Sorry to interrupt you again, but that one we have already read, all the group.
Okay.
Yes, and we discussed this in one of the meetings.
Great.
And the last one as well, the one on the famous.
Right. So if we talk about language and relation, it is language and emotion. Sorry. What I'm going to do now, I'm making the step from looking at the field of linguistics to language itself. But before we do that, I want to make clear, I mean, it is clear, but so that we are on the same page, that we have clearly distinguished the different levels that are involved and realize that certain concepts, labels belong to one level and not to the other, and how they are related to a label, a notion in the other level. And of course, we're talking here about the affective realm, and that is everything that is has to do with emotions, attitudes, moods, stance. I mean, this list is simply taken from the literature. These labels are used to label parts of this whole field of emotions and related stuff. I mean, moods are maybe a little bit different from emotions. I mean, that's a long story. What is exactly mood and what is exactly stance and what is exactly a passion, and partly they overlap and so on. But it's just to indicate that this is the real world stuff in our mind, or whatever the emotions are that we are talking about. And in semantics, so if this affective stuff is coded in language, then we come to semantics, and there we find reflections of this affective stuff in emotive meaning, in expressive meaning, in connotation, in valence, in evaluation, or more specifically in such phenomena as mirrative, apprehensive, tepidity. I will talk about it later as examples of emotive meaning in language. So these are semantic, technical semantic terms, so to say. And it is important to distinguish the affective realm and the semantic realm. And I have a quote here from Laura's book, The Evaluation in Context, where she and Thompson express that they realize that evaluation and stance belong to these different levels. Evaluation constitutes the expression of the speaker's stance or attitude. Thus, evaluation and stance are not exactly the same thing. From this perspective, stance would be a more abstract concept, and evaluation would be the actual verbal realization or manifestation of stance. So stance belongs in the affective realm. I can have a psychological stance, and it is reflected in certain linguistic words or constructions, and then we talk about evaluation, right? So I don't, this supports the point that it is important to clearly distinguish when we use a notion talking about emotion or stance and other notions that are semantic in nature. Of course, we need linguistic forms, and as Jacobson says, we find them on all levels, in phonology, in writing, in morphology, in function words, in content words, in constructions, sentence types. At least that is the assumption, that in principle the emotive meaning is not located only in the interjections or only in morphology or whatever. And as we have seen in the first lecture of today, if we use language and want to communicate emotion, the emotive effect is not only brought into the communication on the basis of the linguistic forms that are used. Part of the effect is used by is realized by how we use language in context, and that's, I would say, that is studied in pragmatics. It makes a difference if we use direct or indirect discourse, or free indirect discourse. I mean, direct discourse, if I quote someone in direct discourse, it's more lively, more emotive. We have seen repetition of pronouns can have an emotive effect. If I break off a sentence, if I use figurative language, expressive speech acts, if I use certain words that do not fit in this context, so stylistic mismatch, this all can have emotive effects, but they are not part of the language system, so to say. They arise in language use in context. That is the conclusion of this slide. Thus, not all expressivity in linguistic communication comes purely from the linguistic forms as provided by the system of language. But my interest is primarily in these linguistic forms and the emotive meaning they carry and bring in. Here is an example of pragmatic research language use. I recently read this very interesting dissertation by Annemieke Drummen, Dramatic Pragmatics, a discourse approach to particle use in ancient tragedy and comedy. After the introduction of Lachlan, you will understand why I read it, because I'm still interested in particles, and this is about particles in Old Greek, in ancient Greek discourse. And she has a chapter on calm and versus agitated discourse, and looks at the stylistic features of these of calm discourse and agitated discourse, and she observed that this particle ge, that indicates a contrast, is very frequent in agitated discourse. It relates to someone that was said in the first lecture by Laura Hidalgo, that contrast can play a role in making the discourse more engaged. So Annemieke Drummen says, ge functions are connected to the speaker's personal involvement. Indeed, I have found ge in both tragedy and comedy to be particularly frequent in angry or otherwise agitated contexts. So it would be wrong to say that ge has emotive meaning, but the way it is used in this text and creating contrast or indicating contrast very often, it makes the discourse, the text more lively. And here is another level that we should take into consideration. I mean, the emotions and the language are implemented in a way in the brain, and if we read the literature on language and emotion, every now and then we encounter certain notions that have to do with parts of the brain that are involved, and we find such labels as limbic system, the amygdala, anterior cingulate cortex, the ventral striatum, the right hemisphere. So this latter part, I will come back to the right hemisphere later. Diana van Lanker-Cites said, I quote, "Several studies report greater electrical responses to emotional words in the right hemisphere than the left." I mean, we have this idea that language is processed in the left hemisphere, but emotive language maybe, we have to explore it further, also involves the right hemisphere. So, as a conclusion from my reading of the literature, I want to stress again that it is important to distinguish between research on conceptualization of emotion and research on expression of emotion. I said that in cognitive linguistics there is not much attention for language and emotion, but this only holds for the expression of emotion. For conceptualization of emotion, there's a lot of literature. People like Anna Wierzbicka, Zoltán Kövecses, Angelika Athanasiadou, and many others have written a lot about metaphors and metonymy that are used to talk about emotions. About labels for emotions and the use of figurative language to talk about emotions. And that's what I call some conceptualization of emotions. And here there is not a principal difference between talking about emotions and talking about the world, colors, or the weather. Emotions are also part of the world. And if I talk about a mountain, I can also use a metaphor as the foot of the mountain. And if I talk about emotion, I can also say his hair stood, what is it? On end. We say dat zijn haar rezen te bergen. So emotion, metaphors based in the body to talk about emotions in the same way as we talk about the rest of the world. So that's what I mean with conceptualization of emotion. But I see a principal difference to expression of emotion. That is a different story. And maybe the story is not completely different. We'll come back later to it, whether we can keep up this strict dichotomy. But that is my first bit, that it is something different whether I express an emotion or whether I talk about emotion. I cannot express part of the world, but I can express emotion. I can talk about part of the world, and I can talk about emotion. So emotion is same and different. So how can we convince the emotion in language skeptics like Sapir? Well, by showing them pieces of language, words or parts of speech or constructions where emotive meaning is coded. And we can say, hey, but there are all these interjections that have an emotive meaning. But I'm afraid that the skeptic will say, yeah, but emotion or interjections are marginal, so this does not convince me really. Yeah, but many words, non-interjections have connotation, have valence. The skeptic might say, and Sapir says it, well, this connotation is very variable between people. There's another quote from his book from 1921. To be sure, there are socially accepted feeling tones for many words over and above the force of individual association, but they are exceedingly variable and elusive things at best. They rarely have the rigidity of the central primary fact. Again, if we talk about connotation, Sapir is skeptic. It is the whole tone of this quote is connotation does not convince me as an argument for your claim that emotion is strongly present in language. If you can give examples from grammar, morphology, and syntax, then Sapir would be more impressed. But first, let's have a short look at lexicon. Well, we could talk about many words with strong emotion, like curses, swearing, slurs, but we don't want to look at these ugly words. Words for endearment are nicer for today. So in many languages, I and heart are used as terms of endearment, and I and heart have positive associations. And I read somewhere, Richard, that in some languages they want to have stronger words for endearment, and then they take intestines or stomach or liver or lung. So you can say to your beloved one, "my lung," and that is even more endearing than my eye or my heart. These latter lexical sources provide relatively novel, hence more expressive variants of endearment words, and replace the conventionalized body part term heart. And then I had the association, how about Dutch poepje and scheetje? Don't sound very nice, but they are used as words of endearment. Lachlan will know. For children, but you can also use it for adult people. Well, I'm not sure. Maybe for your, we should explore it. I will come back to this phenomenon that words with by itself may be a strong negative association. They have a strong emotional side to it, and maybe that is the reason why they are turned upside down and can used in a very positive way. Well, and then I thought we should also look at animals and the positive associations we have with certain animals, because they also are a source domain for terms of endearment. In German, you can say mouse for your beloved one, or Bärchen, my little bear. Well, so this is lexicon. And you can say, well, yeah, but terms of endearment and cursing and slurs, that is a separate group. But I want to say here that many ordinary words have some emotional touch to it. And in linguistics, we have this label connotation, but this a systematic exploration of the emotive connotational meaning of words has not taken place in linguistics. It is in psychology, in fact, that in recent years there's a whole line of research where in a systematic way they have explored the connotative or valence meaning of words. And this, in fact, goes back to Osgood and others, the measurement of meaning, 1957. And systematized in a way by Bradley and Lang. They developed a list of words, more than 1,000 words, and asked many subjects to rate these words on a scale of 1 to 9. 1 is very negative, 9 is very positive. So affective ratings of words, affective ratings of words. And this has been imitated, replicated for Spanish, for Dutch, for German. So now the psychologists have these lists of words with the valence. And for them it is very important, because if you do experimental psychological research, you have to know the frequency of the stimulus words, because frequent words are processed more quickly than non-frequent words, and the same turns out to hold for emotional words. Emotional words are digested, so to say, much quicker than neutral words. So you have to have these affective norms for your words, otherwise your experimental work is not reliable. But we as linguists, I think, can profit from their research and say, hey, now we also have an idea about connotation of words. And the general finding of this kind of research is that valence or connotation is more consistent than Sapir thought. You remember he said it's very variable. But if you ask people about how positive or negative words like slim or slender or skinny or scrawny sound, and you rate them on a scale from 1 to 9, I think that there is a kind of common, that our ratings will not be so different. I mean, I don't, as a I mean, I'm not a native speaker of English, and I don't know exactly how negative scrawny sounds, but maybe I should give it a 2 or on a scale of 9. And those who really know English would give a score that is rather close, maybe also 2 or 3, right? And I mean, if that is the finding, then apparently scrawny is an emotive word. It is a negative loaden word, and maybe slim less so, and so on. So I did this kind of research with my students. We explored Dutch and German, and so we used this a new example and applied it to Dutch and asked subjects to rate words. And I just mention here one interesting finding, that in the American ratings, fireworks is very positive. It's a great positive thing. But in Holland, the counterpart, vuurwerk, firework, got rather low scores and with a big standard deviation. So some people still like fireworks, but others score it rather in a negative way. And this has to do with the discussion in the past years about whether people should be allowed to have fireworks at New Year's Eve. It causes a lot of noise and damage and accidents, and so here is one could say a meaning change going on, and that explains the big variation in connotation. But otherwise, more stable words have a rather stable valence. Well, this L2 is maybe not important now. Here is a small sample of new values. So very negative words that scored lower than 2.5, abuse, accident, and so on. And very positive words, acceptance, achievement, admire, and so on. Yeah, and this with so if you look at the standard deviation in these scores, these standard deviations are not very big. So agony is a negative loaded word for most normal speakers of English. Yesterday we had a discussion about, but this emotional value of words is very context dependent. If a veterinarian talks about a cat, it's a neutral word, and if your daughter talks about a cat, it has a... that's also true, but this is also true. So, I mean, we can discuss it more. There is, in certain specific contexts, the emotion can change, but apparently in a speech community, there's also a kind of common sense about this. And should we then exclude this part of the meaning from the meaning of the word? I would say no, it's really part of it, the emotive part. This new stuff led me and my students to studying intensifiers. So if we have time, how...
You have
quarter of an hour. And maybe we should skip the intensifiers because it's in my overview. I only say what it is about, but I'm not going through it. One of the articles that I strongly recommend to read, I like it very much. It's one of the most nice papers I've read in recent years, is Zhuo Ying Schmidt, Negative Bias in Language, a Cognitive Affective Model of Emotive Intensifiers, in the journal Cognitive Linguistics, that is the journal of the ICLA. And she observes that in many languages, intensifiers are taken from very negative words, like terrible, sinfully, and so on. And we explored this and she explains that in the sense that negative emotions are stronger than positive emotions. That's why negative emotions are a good source for strong intensifiers, right? And if you use them in a positive discourse, then they are more against a positive background, they have a strong impact. So we explored Dutch expressive intensifiers, and we found many intensifiers that go back to a word with a literal meaning in a very negative, with a very negative connotation. Like bloody, scaringly, dangerously beautiful. And these are the innovation of these expressive intensifiers can in particular be found with young people. They apparently have the need to be expressive, and they invent, they go to the negative lexicon, so to say, and bring in new ones. So, and when we were brainstorming about this, and we said, well, are there still very negative words that we haven't seen in our data? Yeah, for example, cancer is a very negative word. Let's Google it, and then you find cancer beautiful. Indeed, the young people have used it already. So we, in a sense, predicted, well, if it isn't used yet, it is a candidate, and indeed you already find it. So, yeah, this was, so to say, fun to explore. Let's go to morphology. And I read in Laura's book that Spanish has these suffixes, ucho, uco, azo, largirucho, casuco, manatzas. They have a negative loading, right? Is that right? Okay. Well, in Dutch we have similar suffixes. The o, Brabo, that is someone from Brabant, from the province of Brabant, but if you say he's a Brabo, that has a negative evaluation, and from Limburg. And happy is blij in Dutch. You can make the word blijo, someone who is always happy, but with a negative evaluation, right? And sul also has a negative connotation. So it is there are morphological, there are suffixes that have emotive meaning. And preparing this talk, I discovered that the evaluative morphology is now kind of established. There is a handbook of evaluative morphology where they have overviews of evaluative morphology in different languages. So now it still has to make its way to cognitive linguistics, maybe, but in morphology, evaluation is an established line of research on different languages and has made it into a handbook. Of course, diminutives are very strong in emotive meaning. I recommend this classic paper by Daniel Juravsky, Universal Tendencies in Semantics of the Diminutive. And diminutives develop many different meanings. It's a polysemic suffix, but in many languages it develops affective meanings, positive and negative. Like in Spanish, abuelita, but also abogadito, it can be negative. In Dutch, the diminutive suffix is ja, so house, little house, that is neutral, but treasure, little treasure, as a term of endearment, it makes it more affective. And if you say that somebody has praatjes, talks, diminutive, means pretentious talking, or lachlan, maybe the translation is not optimal, but it's very negative. He has praatjes. So you can use the diminutive suffix for adding negative evaluation of the stem meaning. Exploring recently, I saw that even interjections can be combined with a diminutive, whoopsie, oopsie, and in this paper, Dorothy Lockyer explores the extra emotive meaning that is added to the already interjection. It is in this, preparing this talk, I discovered this nice journal, Skaze. It is the Slovakian, it is a Slovakian Journal of Theoretical Linguistics online. You can, so it's open online, and it has very nice papers. I didn't know it before. Let's go to syntax. I mean, syntax is the most convincing part, probably, if we argue with Sapir. Diana van Lanken says it's probably the most emotion-sanitized component of language. Nevertheless, we find constructions. I mean, I think that in the meantime, everybody has heard about mirrativity, Scott Delancey's research. And you can say, well, mirrativity is the semantic notion for surprise. So the affection of, you can say, well, is that an emotion? Is that an affection? Is that a stance? It is strongly related to knowledge and to expectations, and these are rather cognitive. But we say that you feel surprised, and so something can be a pleasant or an unpleasant surprise. So the way we talk about surprise is, as we treat it as something emotional, I would say. So many languages have special mirrative suffixes in the verb, like in Tibeto-Burman languages here. So I can tell you they already went, but when I add the mirrative suffix, then this can only be used when I enter a room and I expect them to be there, and they already went. Oh my, I'm totally surprised. And there is a special construction to express that. We maybe in Spanish or Dutch or English we would have to say, they already went with intonation, so to say. Then you can do the same. But here there is morphological, syntactic means to express that. You can also do mirrative in another way, like English with no, and I read that, and I want to check that with you as native speakers. If you use the past tense, Juan fuma ba, you can use it as a mirrative when you observe that Juan smokes. I didn't expect that. With the past tense, is that, I see, there is support for this observation here. So that's interesting to see that past tense can be used as a strategy to express mirrative meaning, so to say. And this also happens in other languages, like in this Mapudungun language, where you use a non-first-hand evidential for expressing something mirrative. Maybe this is less familiar, the apprehensive to express fear, but Marine Feuer-Meff from Lyon contributed to the Festschrift that I got when I retired 2 months ago, and she has a contribution about the apprehensive in Ese-Eya, a South American language that she's researching. And the apprehensive is a construction where you express fear. Fear that something will happen, for example, with the hearer. So you can say, so typically in such utterance like, you may slip, then you add this chana, and this morpheme means, I'm afraid that you will fall. So it's a kind of empathic fear. And as a strategy, tu vas tomber, the future, to express this kind of fear. And in Dutch, that you don't fall, dat je niet valt. So a subordinate clause, it can be used for other means, so it does not strictly mean apprehensive, but it can very well be used for apprehensive purposes. And this straks, it's hard to translate, straks val je nog, but if you start an utterance with straks, the adverb, in a minute or later, you will fall. It evokes already that probably you want to express the fear that something bad will happen in the near future. So and apparently, according to Marine Veillermet, apprehensive, so this fear meaning is grammaticalized in different languages as a construction, as a special thing. A recent paper in the journal Lingua reports that in Korean, this particle na, that has many meanings, developed also a meaning for expressing tepidity. And tepidity means that the speaker is rather neutral about the outcome of something. So reducing the engagement. You can say tepidity is not an emotion, but it's also kind of, or a stance. Maybe it's more a stance, an attitude. So you can say, let's watch a movie, but if you add to this word movie the suffix na, then you express, let's watch a movie, but we could also do something else, right? And this reminded me to a reference that I have in this last overview paper in French, on va leur téléphoner, histoire de, voir s'ils sont là. Let's call them to see whether they are there, but if they are not there, also okay, it's not very important. Histoire de is apparently grammaticalizing in French as a way to indicate, well, it's not a big deal. It's becoming part of the grammar, of a construction. And this reminded me of Dutch particle maar in certain contexts. Ik ga maar naar huis, I better go home. It has this connotation, I would prefer to stay here, but the party is more or less over, then I better go home. It adds the meaning of resignation. This content, sentence final particle, what? Sentence final particle, jetzt in German, wie viel gibt's denn jetzt, how many are there now? It expresses impatience. This is a well-known construction, a subject with an infinitive, incredulity, explored by or introduced by Knut Lambrecht, a study of this construction, and apparently it's widespread in many languages. Greek conditionals, there are 3 Greek conditional ifs, but one of them shows that what is said in the if clause is very important for the speaker, that the speaker is involved in this. So if you say, if you love me, then you should use this ama and not one of the other conditional markers. This is, well, I have to skip some of the constructions. This interesting construction, this is a construction, a very special construction that always carries emotional meaning. I mean, there are words used here that already are emotive, but the construction itself is also devoted to emotive meaning. And it's very productive in Dutch, and there you can use non-emotive words like tree or cloud, but if you put them in this construction, it becomes emotive. So if I say a tree of a guy came to me, it means I was very impressed, or I was afraid, or some association with a big thing. The construction itself indicates that I, as a speaker, am emotionally touched by what happened. Marked work order, sarcastic syntax. Laura Michaelis in a recent manuscript. Yeah, this first we should read this first example. Whenever anyone says to me, "Hey, let's have, look, we are going to have a dinner. It's going to be at 8:38. What is this? Spain?" Said in the United States, and you can also use, of course, this split interrogative, as she calls it, for a neutral question. What is this? But Laura Michaelis claims that it is often used for sarcastic purposes, and so the speaker of English or American English knows that when she wants to be sarcastic, this construction is a good way to be sarcastic. And with these, when you say, "What are you, a New Yorker or something, or some kind of," if you add that, then it cannot be something else than the sarcastic version of the construction. Insubordination, and so on, phrasal compounds. So, yeah, coming back to conceptualization versus expression, but how much time can I
think you have to wind up now.
wind up? 3 minutes, okay. Well, all these morphemes and constructions, I hope, have convinced you, or would convince Sapir, if he was still among us, that there is a lot of emotion or stance coded in the linguistic system. That is my main message. I mean, if I send you the PowerPoint, you can read the rest of it. Maybe I point out Bernd Heine and Tanja Kuteva are well known for their research on grammaticalization. And recently they developed a new grammar model. They call it discourse grammar. And linguists like a grammar model, functional grammar or cognitive grammar or generative grammar. And now here we have a new model, and they split up, they make a strong distinction in the language system between sentence grammar and tactical grammar. Tactical grammar is an abbreviation of taken from parenthetical, right, parenthetical. And in tactical grammar deals with parts of the grammar that have to do with text organization, attitudes of the speaker, and so on. So not the strict verb and the arguments and the adjuncts, the core of the sentence, so to say, but all this other stuff they put in what they call tactical grammar. And they claim that tactical grammar aspects are processed in the right hemisphere. So I thought this is an exciting proposal. So here are some examples. Oh my goodness. But also parentheticals like "I thought," "I'm glad to say," and "I don't blame her," "perversely enough." These parts of utterances are processed, well, they say it like this. On the basis of the evidence presented, it would seem safe to conclude that in the same way that sentence grammar is unlikely to be activated without the participation of the left hemisphere, it is equally unlikely that the activation of statical grammar phenomena can be achieved without any participation of the right hemisphere. So they don't, this is a rather modest way of saying it, participation of the right hemisphere. And again, irrespective of whether or to what extent parts of the left hemisphere may be involved, the linguistic expression of emotive concepts appears to be associated in some way with right hemisphere activity. And they refer to this reference that I mentioned before, Diana van Lanker-Citis, a neuro scientist who studies language. She's in Canada, and she has evidence for the involvement of the right hemisphere in processing part of language, and in particular these aspects. So to indeed conclude, emotive meaning is undeniably present in language on all levels, contra the skeptics, not contraceptics, but contra the skeptics. More and more descriptive linguistic research reports emotive phenomena. So the examples I've given are taken from very recent research, and my impression is that the field is indeed moving in the right direction. But linguistic theory, and I address in particular my own framework, so to say cognitive linguistics, still has to develop in such a way that emotion is given its proper place in a general model of language. Okay, thank you.
Well, I think that we are all feeling enormous gratitude to Ad for encouraging us, really, in many ways, in our work on emotion, and showing us the way, and bringing to our attention a huge armory, really, of research that is being carried out in various parts of the world on different kinds of languages, and so on. We're very, very grateful indeed. There is still, I think, a little bit of time for discussion. If you want to intervene, please get the microphone so that it can be recorded.
I want.
Right.
I want to say something.
No.
In the meeting we had the day before yesterday, we were speaking about also the conceptualization and the expression of emotion. And we thought, well, I think, in fact, that it has a lot to do with what Monica Bednarek called emotion talk and emotional talk. In her article in, I think it's 2008. So I think that emotion talk would correspond to the conceptualization of emotion, and emotional talk to the expression of emotion. Yeah. And that's also within, evaluation theory and all that. Yes.
Yeah. So if I had more time, I would have gone into this distinction, and although I have stressed that we should distinguish it, I would also make an opening for relativizing the distinction. I have these examples here. Love is blind. John hates his boss. Peter saw an angry dog.
Yeah, you have both things.
These are, I would say, examples where conceptualization is primary, or I'm talking about emotions in the world. As I'm saying something about love, or John and his emotions, and Peter and his emotions. But if I talk about my own emotions, like I like Madrid, I love you, I detest spinach, maybe it is a little bit strange to say I'm conceptualizing my emotions. If I say I love you, and if I at the same time say, no, I'm conceptualizing my emotion that I have for you. So maybe if I say I love you, I'm expressing my emotion maybe, although I'm still more directly expressing my emotion, but I use an interjection like, yuck, for disgust. So
I think you have both things there. You conceptualize because you use a word that has been conceptualized to express this feeling of love, but then there's the intonation and even body language that expresses the emotion.
yeah, and
So-
maybe also the first person pronoun brings it into the more expressive dimension, so to say. So this was one of the topics for further research, how this distinction should be made in the end. And maybe it also has to do with semiotic, this semiotic distinction between symbol, icon, and symptom, that icons and symptoms are more direct than symbols. So,
it's difficult to categorize always. And then another things we discussed was when talking about valence, Lachlan gave a very interesting presentation, that when we speak about words in isolation, and then of course we say, well, of course if you have them in context, then you're going to have different valences, perhaps depending on the context. So I try to make the analogy to what Leach called absolute politeness and relative politeness. I think it has to do with it, but because there's an absolute valence that you may, elicit from all native speakers of a language about certain words like cancer, this and that. They're going to say this is negative, very negative. But there's also the relative valence of words when you use them in different contexts. So we have both things. So both things are useful. Then. Just a comment.
I didn't really think about language use, so to say, in different contexts. So my focus has been so strongly on the language system, and if we have a good overview of what is available in the language system, then the next step would indeed be to look at the use of these linguistic means in different contexts and to see whether in how far the emotive meaning is stable in use.
There were examples in the presentation you gave because you had very negative, but that isolatedly they are very negative words, and then they were used with positive expressions. Or I miss you sorely, or those ones that you.
But here I would say this positive use has become part of the language system, because these negative words are recruited from content words like terror, and then terribly can be used with a positive word like terribly nice or terribly bad. It has developed the meaning of strong intensification. It has given up the negative meaning, and it has grammaticalized into an intensifier that can be used with positive and negative adjectives.
Okay. Any questions? No more? All right. So thank you very much indeed. I think it's been a very interesting presentation, and we've learned a lot from you both, from Laura and Ad. Thank you very much.